Savannah, Georgia, July 2024. Our backyard smelled of charcoal and hot sun. I was standing at the grill, flipping steaks that I knew no one but me would appreciate. Caitlin, my wife, was sitting at the wooden table in her perfect white dress, like she stepped out of a billboard. She was giggling at something on her phone, and I knew right away that it wasn't some meme from a friend. No, it was something that made her cheeks flush and her eyes dart around. I wasn't an idiot, even though she seemed to think I was blind. "Will, haven't burned the meat, have you?" she shouted, not looking up from the screen. "Don't worry, dear, I'm a grill master," I said, adding a drop of venom to my voice, which, of course, she ignored. Olivia, our 16-year-old daughter, rolled her eyes as she sat on the swing, lemonade in hand. She was in her usual uniform, black t-shirt, ripped jeans, and a look that screamed, "You're all pissing me off." Ethan, our 18-year-old son, was glued to his phone, but I noticed him sneaking sideways glances at his mother. Something about this family barbecue smelled worse than burnt charcoal. For the past few months, Caitlin had been acting like a stranger. She'd always been career-obsessed, but now it was getting out of hand. The late nights, the calls she'd take in the bathroom, the new perfume that made my nose itch. She kept saying it was a gift from a coworker, but I didn't believe a word of it. I tried to connect with her. Dinner out on the town, a trip to the coast, even tickets to see her favorite band. But every time I get the excuse, "I'm tired, a project at work, maybe later," later never fucking came. "Olivia, help me with the salad," I said, trying to distract myself from the thoughts that were buzzing in my head like a swarm of flies. "Seriously, Dad, I eat meat, not grass," she snapped, but she stood up and shuffled toward the table. Caitlin finally put her phone down, but only to pour herself more wine. She glanced at me, and I waited for her to say something normal, like she used to, when we were a family and not extras on this shitty show. But instead, she said, "Will you forget that I have a corporate party tomorrow? I'll be back late." "Late?" I asked, jabbing my fork into the steak a little harder than necessary. "Late until midnight? Or until morning?" She frowned, but her eyes were pure theater. I knew that look. She thought I would swallow any lie like a cheap hot dog. "Don't start, Will. It's work. You know how much I need this promotion." "Oh yeah, a promotion," I nodded, grinning in a way that should have made her feel like I was on to something. "Your boss is probably thrilled about your overtime." Olivia snorted, pouring dressing over her salad. Ethan looked up, and I saw his jaw tense. Caitlin shot me a look that could have pierced concrete, but I just shrugged. If she wanted to play this game, I was willing to up the ante. "You're unbearable," she hissed, sipping her wine. "Maybe you could try supporting me for a change." "Support?" I slammed the plate of meat down on the table, and it clanged. "I've supported you for 20 years, Kate. The house, the kids, your damn 5 grand wardrobe. What else should I support? Your new perfume?" Olivia giggled, but Caitlin didn't laugh. She jumped up, grabbed the phone, and walked into the house, slamming the door so hard the glass shook. Of course, it was classic. When she had nothing to say, she just ran away. "Dad, you're overreacting," Ethan said, but there was no conviction in his voice. He glanced at the door through which Mother had disappeared, and I realized he'd noticed something too. "Too much." I plopped down on a chair, cutting off a piece of steak. "Ask your sister what she thinks." Olivia shrugged, chewing on a leaf of lettuce, as if he had personally insulted her. "Mom's been weird lately. That new perfume of hers smells like a $1,000 boutique. And she's always yapping on the phone when she thinks I'm not listening." "Olivia, stop," Ethan said, but I saw his fingers tighten around the phone. He knew more than he was letting on. "What did you hear?" I asked, trying to keep my voice even though everything inside me was boiling like oil in a frying pan. "Nothing special." She looked away, but I knew my daughter. She saw or heard something, and it wasn't gossip from her TikTok. "Leave her, Dad," Ethan said, standing up. "I'm not hungry. I'm going to my room." He left, and I looked at Olivia. She was picking at her salad, but her eyes were like lasers. This girl was smarter than she looked. "Dad, do you really think Mom? You know," she lowered her voice as if she was afraid Caitlin would overhear from the house. "I don't know," I lied, because I didn't want to drag her into this shit. "But I'll figure it out." She nodded, but I could tell she didn't believe me. Hell, I didn't believe myself. I'd spent 20 years building this family, hauling bricks, signing contracts for eco-homes, so we could have this yard, this house, this damn grill. And now what? My wife was wandering around while I played chef to kids who knew more than they were telling. I sipped my beer and watched the sunset over Savannah. The sky was as red as my anger. I tried to be a good husband. Dinners, flowers, trips, I did everything to recapture the spark we once had. But Caitlin, she only withdrew like I was an old couch that needed to be thrown out, and her office parties. I wasn't an idiot. No one worked until 3 in the morning in a $1,000 dress. "Dad, are you okay?" Olivia looked at me, and I realized I had been silent for too long. "Yeah, baby," I smiled, but it was a fake smile, and she knew it. "Eat meat," I tried. She snorted, but took the piece. I looked toward the house, where Caitlin was probably on the phone again. My hand tightened around the bottle of beer, the glass creaking. I didn't want to believe she was lying to me, but I wasn't blind, and I certainly wasn't stupid. The evening dragged on like chewing gum. Caitlin came back to the table, but she didn't look me in the eye. She chatted with the kids, joked, smiled, as if nothing was happening. I kept quiet because I knew that if I opened my mouth, I would spill everything I thought. And then either I would regret it or not, but everything would fall apart right then and there. After the kids went to bed, I was sitting on the porch with another beer. Caitlin came out, but she didn't sit next to me like she had before. She stood with her arms crossed, looking at me like I was an inconvenience. "Will, what's wrong? You've been on edge all evening," she said, and I almost laughed at her impudence. With me, I put the bottle on the table and turned to her. "And what about you, Kate? The new perfume, the late nights, the phone you hide like a spy. Do you want me to believe that this is all work?" Her eyes narrowed, but she didn't lose her composure. "You're paranoid, Will. I work so we can afford this life. What are you doing? Frying steaks and getting mad at me for trying." "Trying." I stood up, and she took a step back. "Who are you trying for, Kate? For me? For the kids? Or for the person who buys you perfume?" She opened her mouth, but said nothing. She just looked at me like I'd hit her. Then she turned and walked into the house. The door slammed, and I was left alone with the beer and the anger that burned inside me like a hot coal. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in our bedroom, listening to Caitlin toss and turn on her side of the bed. She thought I didn't know. She thought I was just a tired guy who would swallow her lies. But she was wrong. I didn't. He was going to sit back while she destroyed everything I had built. The morning after the barbecue was heavy as a hangover, even though I'd only had a few beers. Caitlin left for work before I could make coffee, with her usual, "Don't wait up for me until late" parting shot. I stood at the kitchen window, watching her car pull out of the driveway, and thought, "Do you really think I'm that stupid, Kate?" My insides were seething, but I kept my cool. If I was going to expose her dirty little secrets, I needed a plan, not a fight over nothing. I pulled Jack Carter's business card out of the desk drawer. His name was printed in bold, and underneath it, in smaller letters, "Private Investigations. Discretion guaranteed." Discretion was exactly what I needed. I didn't want Olivia or Ethan to find out their father was digging through their mother's dirty laundry. It wasn't time yet. I dialed the number, and after 2 rings he answered. "Carter," his voice was hoarse, as if he smoked a pack a day. "This is Will Harper," I said, trying to sound firmer than I felt. "We talked yesterday. I want to hire you." "Fine, Mr. Harper. Let's meet. The Bean Cafe on Broughton Street in an hour. Bring $3,000 to get you started. Cash." 3,000. I almost choked. "Is that for a couple of days of work?" "That's for the truth," he snapped. "If you change your mind, I won't be offended." I gripped the phone so tightly my fingers went white. $3,000 was our family fund, The money Caitlin and I had been saving for our vacation. Oh, the irony. She was funding her own exposé. Half the fund was hers, so she was basically footing half the bill. I almost smiled at the thought. "I'll be there," I said and hung up. I peeked into the kids' bedroom. Olivia was still asleep, her head buried in her pillow, and Ethan had already left for summer college. Good, fewer questions. I grabbed my keys and wallet and drove into downtown Savannah. The Bean Cafe was a typical tourist spot. Wooden tables, the smell of freshly brewed coffee, and waitresses with forced smiles. Jack Carter sat in the corner, leafing through a newspaper. He was in his 50s, graying at the temples and a face that had seen too much shit. His jacket was wrinkled, like he'd slept in it. I sat down across from him, placing an envelope of cash on the table. "Will Harper," I introduced myself, although he already knew who I was. "Jack," he nodded, putting the newspaper away. "So, your wife, what did she do?" I hesitated. Saying it out loud was like opening an abscess, but I forced myself to. I think she's cheating on me. Late nights, secret calls, new perfume. All this shit. I want to know the truth." Jack chuckled as if I had told him the weather forecast. Classic. "Okay, give me her name, work address, schedule. Photos if you have them. I'll start today. Usually a week is enough to dig up something worthwhile." "What if there is nothing?" I asked, although deep down I knew that there was definitely something. "Then you spent $3 grand on peace of mind," he shrugged, opening the envelope and counting the money. "But judging by your tone, Mr. Harper, you already know the answer." I handed him a folder of information: Caitlin's name, her office address, a couple of family photos. She was smiling at them, but I couldn't look at them without feeling sick. Jack stuffed the folder into his battered briefcase. "I'll call when I have something to say." "Don't call me yourself, it's annoying," he said, standing up. "And don't do anything stupid while I'm working. No arguments, no interrogations. Behave as usual." "As usual," I chuckled. "Does that mean pretending my wife isn't hanging out somewhere?" "Exactly," he nodded and left, leaving me with an unfinished coffee and a check. I sat in the cafe for another 10 minutes, trying to collect my thoughts. $3,000. Half of it was Caitlin's money. I imagined her finding out her vacation fund was going to a detective, and I almost laughed. It was the only joy I had all morning. By midday, I was driving to the construction site of one of our eco-homes on the outskirts of Savannah. My company, Harper Green, built houses with solar panels and all that eco-friendly crap that was all the rage these days. It was my bread and butter, my pride. I loved the smell of freshly cut wood and the sound of hammers, but today, even that couldn't get me out of a hole. I noticed a new girl on the landing, drawing on a tablet next to the half-finished garden. She was wearing jeans, a white shirt, and a straw hat, as if she had just escaped from a farmer's market. Her hair, dark blonde, was pulled back into a messy bun, and she was frowning at the flower bed as if it were her personal enemy. "Problems with dirt?" I asked, coming closer. She looked up, and I noticed that her eyes were green, like the moss on the Savannah oak trees. She smiled, but not the fake smile I was used to from Caitlin. "Problems with the client," she said, nodding toward the flower bed. "They want roses, but there's too much shade. I'm trying to convince them to plant ferns, but they're stubborn." "Clients are always a pain in the ass," I said, extending my hand. "Will Harper, this is my project." "Madison Crowe." She shook my hand, her palm warm and calloused from work. "Landscaper. I was hired to do this." "Crowe?" I asked. "Aren't you one of those crows who runs the gallery on River Street?" "My sister, Ruby, hangs out there," she laughed. "And my mom, Helen, comes in sometimes to pester everyone. Family business, you know." I nodded, even though I had no idea what she was talking about. But her laugh was infectious, and for the first time that day, I felt like I could breathe. We started talking. She told me how she hated plastic lawns and how she once planted a field of dandelions to annoy a client. I told her about my first house, which almost collapsed because of a bad foundation. It was easy, like we'd known each other for ages. "Are you always this serious?" she asked as we reached her pickup, which was piled high with bags of soil. "Only when my life is going downhill," I said, and it was more honest than I intended. She looked at me as if she wanted to ask something, but changed her mind. "Well, if anything, ferns solve all problems," she said, smiling, and drove away. I watched her truck disappear around the corner and felt guilty. Hell, I was married. Even to a woman who was probably sleeping with someone else. But I was married. And Madison. She was the breath of fresh air I didn't deserve. Not now. When I got home, I found Caitlin in the living room. She was leafing through a magazine, but I knew it was just for show. Her phone was lying next to her like a loyal dog. "How's the day?" I asked, trying to follow Jack's advice and not make a scene. "It's fine," she didn't look up. "And you?" "Oh, building houses, spending our money," I said, my voice evener than I expected. She looked at me but said nothing. I went into the garage to check my tools, but really I just wanted to get away from her. $3,000. Half of it was hers. I hoped Jack would find something fast because I didn't know how much longer I could pretend. It had been 3 days since I'd hired Jack Carter, and the days had dragged on like cheap gum. Caitlin acted as if nothing was wrong, smiling at breakfast, chatting about the weather, kissing my cheek before leaving for work. But I'd seen her hide her phone, her eyes darting when I asked questions. She thought I was blind, but I was just waiting. Jack had said he needed time, and I tried to keep my cool, even though it was like sitting on a ticking timer. On Friday night, Caitlin announced that she was throwing a little party for coworkers at our house. Little meant that our backyard would be transformed into a circus, with $100 a bottle wine and a bunch of pompous PR people blabbering about their campaigns. I hated these gatherings, but Caitlin insisted. "It's important for work, Will," she said, adjusting her earrings in the mirror. "Daniel's coming, and I need to make an impression." "Daniel, huh?" I stood in the bedroom doorway, arms crossed. "Your boss, who values your talents so much?" She rolled her eyes, but I noticed her fingers twitch as she fastened the necklace. "Don't start, Will. They're just colleagues. Be nice, okay?" "I'm always nice, dear," I said, grinning in a way that must have made her feel the trick. "Just tell me how many glasses I should wash after your carnival." She snorted and went downstairs, where the caterers were already bustling about setting out refreshments. I watched her go, thinking, "Do you really think I'm going to buy this nonsense?" But I kept my mouth shut. Jack had told me to act normal, and I was going to play my part. For now, by 7 p.m., our house had transformed into a scene from a shitty sitcom. The guests, about 20 of them, were hanging out in the living room and backyard, sipping wine and laughing at their own jokes. Caitlin was the center of attention, wearing a tight blue dress that cost more than my car. She was laughing, touching people's hands, and I couldn't help but notice how one guy, tall, in an expensive suit, was hanging a little closer than he needed to be. That had to be Daniel West, her boss. He had a shark-like grin and a look that said, "I know I can take whatever I want." Olivia had locked herself in her room, refusing to hang out with those freaks, but Ethan was home. He was lounging around the living room, holding a bottle of Coke and looking like he wanted to disappear into the ground. I approached him while Caitlin was chatting with the guests. "Having fun?" I asked, nodding towards the crowd. "Yeah, that's awesome," he muttered, not looking at me. "Mom's colleagues are a bunch of show-offs." "Exactly," I said, taking a sip of beer. "Especially the one in the $1,000 suit. That's Daniel, right?" Ethan tensed, but nodded. "Yeah, he's her boss. He hangs around all the time." "Hanging around, you say?" I tried to sound casual, but my insides clenched. "How often?" Ethan shrugged, but his eyes gave him away. He knew something, but he didn't want to say it. I didn't press. It wasn't time yet. I walked into the living room where Caitlin and Daniel were standing by the fireplace, too close together. She was laughing at something he said, and her hand came up to rest on his elbow. It was a small thing, but it felt like a punch to the jaw. I clutched my beer bottle until my knuckles turned white, but I smiled when Caitlin caught my eye. "Will, come here," she called, waving her hand. "Meet Daniel." I walked up, still smiling, although inside I was seething like a volcano. "Will Harper," I said, holding out my hand. "Daniel West," he shook my hand, his grip too strong, as if he wanted to show who was boss. "Caitlin told me a lot about you." "Really?" I raised an eyebrow at her. "And she knows almost nothing about you, only that you inspire her too." Overtime. Caitlin cleared her throat, but Daniel just laughed as if I'd said something brilliant. "Oh, she's the star of our team," he said, looking at her with such a grin that I wanted to punch him. "We'd be lost without her." "I have no doubt," I said, taking a sip of beer. "She's talented." Caitlin gave me a look that said, "Shut up," but I just smiled wider. I was playing the loving husband, like Jack had told me to, but damn, it was like swallowing glass. As the party wore on, I pretended to care about the marketing and sales talk. But I kept my eyes on Caitlin and Daniel. They weren't holding hands or hugging, but there was something about the way he leaned toward her, the way she laughed a little too loudly. It was like a knife in my ribs, and every twist of the blade made me angrier. I went out into the backyard to get some air when I spotted Ethan by the fence. He was standing alone, looking at his phone, but his face was tense. I approached, trying not to scare him. "What, have you already escaped from the show-offs?" I asked, nodding towards the guests. "Yeah," he said, but he didn't smile. "Dad, can I go to my friends? This party sucks." "Wait," I said, lowering my voice. "Are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." He hesitated, looking at the house. I followed his gaze and saw Caitlin and Daniel on the terrace. They were talking quietly, and she was smiling as if he were the only person in the world. "Ethan," I said, trying to keep my voice even, "if you know anything, tell me." He opened his mouth, but then closed it and shook his head. "It's okay, Dad. It's just, Mom is weird." "How strange." I stepped closer, but he stepped back. "Forget it," he said, and went into the house, leaving me alone. I went back to the living room, but I was in a bad mood. Caitlin was still chatting with Daniel, and I decided I'd had enough. I went into the kitchen to get another beer when I heard someone talking around the corner. It was Caitlin, and her voice was low, almost a whisper. "Tomorrow after work," she said. "At the Marriott, no one will know." I froze, feeling the blood pounding in my temples. She was talking on the phone, but I couldn't hear her answer. Just her voice, soft and conspiratorial. "Yes, I know," she continued. "It will be our secret." I wanted to rush in, snatch the phone out of her hand, ask who the hell she was meeting at the Marriott. But I remembered Jack's words, "Don't do anything stupid." I clenched my fists and walked back into the living room, where Daniel was now chatting with another coworker. Caitlin returned a minute later, as if nothing had happened, but I saw her surreptitiously check her phone. Ethan stood at the foot of the stairs, and I saw him looking at his mother. His face was pale, and I knew he'd heard too. He caught my eye, but turned away and went upstairs. I wanted to follow him, but I knew he wasn't ready to talk. Not now. I spent the rest of the evening on autopilot, smiling when I needed to, refilling guests' drinks, joking with some dude about football. But inside, I was a taut string about to snap. Caitlin and Daniel weren't hanging out anymore, but I'd seen him looking at her from across the room. This wasn't just coworkers. This was something dirty, and I knew Jack would find evidence. As the guests left, Caitlin began clearing away the glasses, humming under her breath. I stood at the sink, washing plates, thinking about how much I wanted to smash one against the wall. "So, how was the party?" she asked, as if we were best friends. "Oh, that's just great," I said without turning around. "Your Daniel is a star. So charismatic." She fell silent, and I heard the glass clink in her hand. "Will, are you doing this again?" she said, her voice as cold as ice. "It's work. Stop making things up." "Make it up?" I turned around, wiping my hands with a towel. "Look, Kate, and not blind. and not stupid. Keep playing your games, but don't complain when I start mine." Her eyes widened, but she didn't say anything. She just walked away, leaving me with a pile of dirty dishes and barely contained anger. I knew Jack was working. I knew I'd have answers soon. But damn, the weight was unbearable. A week after that party, I felt like I'd swallowed a grenade, ready to go off. Caitlin was still playing the game. The smiles at breakfast, the small talk about work, the kisses on the cheek that made me sick. But I was doing what Jack Carter said, pretending everything was fine, even though every look, every honey, was like salt in the wound. I knew she was lying. I knew she was meeting that creep Daniel at the Marriott or somewhere. Ethan was suspicious, too. I could see it in the tenseness of his face, but he kept his mouth shut like a gorilla. Olivia, on the other hand, was making barbs about my mother's perfume, but I didn't let her get into it. Kids weren't supposed to be involved in that shit. Yet, on Wednesday morning, Jack called. His voice was as hoarse as the first time, but now there was a note in it that made me sit up straight. "Harper, I have something for you," he said. "Meet me at the Bean in an hour. Bring strong nerves." "What did you find?" I asked, but he had already hung up. I told Olivia I was going to the construction site and ran out of the house. Caitlin was at work, Ethan was at a course, so no one asked questions. At the Bean, I found Jack in the same corner, with the same newspaper. There was a thin black folder on the table, and the sight of it made my mouth go dry. "Sit down," Jack said, without looking up. "And don't make a scene. This isn't a movie." I sat up, my heart pounding like I'd run a marathon. He pushed the folder toward me. "Is that all?" I asked, looking at her as if she were a snake. "Everything you need," he said, sipping his coffee. "Photos, videos, correspondence. Your wife and Daniel West. I wouldn't say it was hard. They weren't exactly hiding." I opened the folder, and the first thing I saw was a photo of Caitlin and Daniel in the lobby of the Marriott. She was laughing, his arm around her waist. The next picture was worse. They were kissing by the elevator, like they couldn't wait to get to their room. My stomach clenched, but I kept scrolling. There were screenshots of their text messages, so messy I almost threw the folder across the table. "I can't wait for tomorrow," she wrote. "You drive me crazy," he wrote back. And a video. It was short, but enough to do me in. They were walking to Daniel's car, hugging each other like a couple on their honeymoon. "How long did it last?" I asked, my voice as hoarse as Jack's. "At least 3 months," he said, shrugging. "Maybe more. I've only dug into it last week." I closed the folder because I couldn't watch anymore. I knew Caitlin was lying, but seeing her hanging out with that bastard was like a knife in the chest. I wanted to scream, to smash something, to find Daniel and smash his pretty face into the pavement. But I just sat there, clutching the folder so tightly my fingers went numb. "What next?" Jack asked, looking at me like I was a bomb with a lit fuse. "Next?" I grinned, but it wasn't laughter. It was something bitter. "Next, I'll crush her." "Don't be silly," he said. "If you want a divorce, hire a lawyer. This evidence will give you everything you need, but don't go to her until you're ready. She might turn everything against you." "Against me?" I stared at him. "She's hanging out with the boss, and I'm supposed to worry." "She's a PR person," Jack said, as if that explained everything. "They know how to spin things. Get a lawyer, Harper, and keep this." He nodded at the file, away from the kids. I nodded, though I was seething inside. Jack finished his coffee, threw a tenner on the table, and walked away, leaving me with the folder and my thoughts tearing me apart. I ordered another coffee, but didn't drink it, just stared out the window at the tourists milling about Broughton Street as if their lives weren't falling apart. By midday, I was sitting in the office of Richard Green, a lawyer recommended to me by a friend from the construction site. Richard was bald, had bushy eyebrows, and a voice like a preacher. I put a folder on his desk, and he scanned the contents without blinking. "It's ironclad, Will," he said, closing the folder. "Infidelity has been proven. In Georgia, that gives you an advantage in dividing property. You can take up to 80% if it goes to trial. 80? I asked again. What if I don't want a trial? Then make a deal, he said, adjusting his glasses. Offer her 50-50, quietly. If she refuses, you have this, he tapped the folder. She won't want these photos shown in court. What about the kids? I asked. How will this affect Olivia and Ethan? Keep them away, he said. Don't show them this. Don't tell them until the divorce is final. They'll figure it out anyway, but don't give them a reason to choose sides. I nodded, but the thought of Olivia or Ethan seeing these photos made me clench my fists. They couldn't know what their mother was like, no matter what they said between her and me. Not now, maybe never. How long will the divorce take? I asked. If she agrees to 50-50, a couple of months, Richard said. If there's a trial, up to a year. But with this, he nodded again at the file, she won't want a trial. I left his office with a plan. Offer Caitlin an amicable divorce, and if she tried to resist, press her with evidence. But inside, I was torn. Part of me wanted to humiliate her, show these photos to everyone, her parents, her coworkers, even her damn yoga class. Wanted her to feel what it was like to have your world crumble. But the other part of me, the part that remembered us dancing at our wedding, the way she laughed when Olivia was born, wanted to just leave quietly. Save face. Not for her, for myself. At home, I hid the folder in a safe in the garage, under boxes of old tools. Caitlin came home late, as usual, and I met her in the living room, pretending to watch TV. She threw her bag on the couch and smiled, as if we were happy. Tired day, she said, stretching. How are you? Oh, you know, I said, not looking up from the screen. Building houses, meeting people. The usual crap. She looked at me but said nothing. I saw her checking her phone, her fingers flying across the screen, probably texting Daniel. The thought made my fists itch, but I just flicked the remote and changed the channel. I'm going to bed, she said, going upstairs. Sleep well, I said, and my voice was so poisonous that she should have suspected something. But she just walked away, leaving me with the TV and the folder that was burning my brain. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in the dark, listening to Caitlin breathe in her sleep, and I imagined handing her that folder. She would look at the photos, the video, and her face would collapse like a house of cards. I wanted revenge. I wanted her to suffer. But I also wanted it to be over, so I could breathe without feeling like I was suffocating. In the morning, I found Olivia at the kitchen table, eating cereal and flipping through the phone. Ethan was at a course, so we were alone. Dad, you look like a zombie, she said without looking up. Thanks, baby, I said, pouring coffee. Just didn't sleep. Because of Mom? She asked, her voice quieter than usual. I froze, looking at her. She knew more than she was saying, but I couldn't tell her the truth. Not now. It's just work, I lied. Don't worry about it. She chuckled, but didn't believe it. For 2 days after meeting Jack Carter, I walked around like a zombie, with a folder of evidence hidden in my safe and anger burning inside. Caitlin acted like nothing was wrong, making coffee in the morning, chatting about work, even trying to hug me before she left. But every gesture she made was like a knife, and I knew she was still talking to Daniel on the phone when she thought I wasn't listening. I did what Jack said, pretending everything was normal, but it was like chewing glass. The lawyer, Richard, said we should wait until the right time to serve Caitlin with the divorce papers, but the wait was unbearable. I wanted her to know. I wanted to see her face crumble when she realized I knew about her dirty deeds. But that Friday night, I decided to dig myself out of my hole. Olivia was at a friend's house, Ethan was at a class, and Caitlin was working late, as usual. I couldn't sit at home anymore, staring at the walls that reminded me of our marriage, so I grabbed my keys and drove to Forsyth Park. It was a place where I could always clear my head. Old oak trees covered in moss, a fountain shooting into the sky, and tourists snapping pictures like they'd never seen water. I just wanted to walk around, maybe get coffee at a kiosk, and not think about Caitlin for at least an hour. I was walking down the path when I noticed a familiar figure standing near one of the flower beds. Madison Crowe, wearing the same jeans and white shirt she had worn at the construction site, was kneeling, digging in the dirt. Her straw hat was lying nearby, and her hair was pulled back into a messy bun. She was muttering to herself as she poked the soil with her trowel, looking like she was about to strangle the flowers. "Clients with roses again?" I asked, coming closer. She flinched, but when she saw me, she smiled. Her green eyes sparkled, and I felt something inside me relax, as if someone had loosened a tight knot. "Will, you scared me," she said, wiping her hands on her jeans. "Not roses, damn hydrangeas. They want blue ones, but the soil here is acidic, like my ex. We'll have to start messing around with fertilizer." "Sounds like my job," I said, sitting down on a bench nearby. "Clients want a palace for pennies and then scream when the roof leaks." She laughed, and the sound was like a sip of cold water on a hot day. I couldn't remember the last time I'd laughed with Caitlin, probably before she started hiding her phone and smelling like someone else's perfume. "What are you doing here?" Maddie asked, sitting down next to him and pulling off her gloves. "You don't look like a park tourist." "I just needed some air," I said, looking at the fountain. "It's too stuffy at home." She nodded, as if she understood more than I had said. We sat in silence for a few minutes, and it wasn't awkward. Just easy, like I could be myself, and not a husband who'd been cheated on or a father who was keeping the truth from his children. "Want some coffee?" I asked, nodding toward the kiosk across the street. "My treat." "Only if it has oat milk lattes," she said, grinning. "I'm a bit of a hippie, you know." "A hippie with a shovel," I said, standing up. "I can respect that." We grabbed coffee and walked back to the bench, chatting about random stuff. She told me about the time she planted a cactus in a client's office because it looked too boring. I told her about the time my worker dropped a beam on a client's car. We laughed, and I found myself grinning like an idiot. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't thinking about Caitlin every second. But then Maddie asked, "So, Will, what's really going on? You look like you've been run over by a truck." I froze, looking at my coffee. I wanted to lie, to say that everything was okay, but her eyes were so sincere that I couldn't. "Just family stuff," I said, shrugging. "Marriage isn't always a rom-com, you know." "Oh, believe me, I know," she said, sipping her latte. "My ex thought marriage was him playing golf and me washing his socks. We divorced 2 years ago." "That's harsh," I said, and it was honest. "Now what? You against the world?" "Not really," she smiled, but there was warmth in her voice. "I have a sister, Ruby, who's a photographer and a total psycho. And my mom, Helen, let's say she has the energy of a 20-year-old. They keep me on my toes." "Sounds like a gang," I said, trying to picture Ruby and Helen. "Are they hippies with shovels too?" "Ruby's more like a hippie with a camera," Maddie laughed. "And Mom, she's like a hurricane in a dress. Once you see it, you'll understand." I nodded, but something inside me clenched. She spoke of her family with such love, and I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt this way. Caitlin, Olivia, Ethan, we were a family, but now it felt like a house of cards, ready to collapse at the slightest push. We chatted for another hour until the sun began to set, bathing the park in golden light. Maddie told me how she hated plastic lawns, and I complained about clients who wanted a green house but no solar panels because they were ugly. It was so simple, so normal. But every time she laughed, I felt a twinge of guilt. I was married, damn it. Even to a liar who was sleeping with the boss. But I was married. And those sparks I felt with Maddie felt like betrayal. Not to Caitlin, she deserved it, but to myself. "I have to go," Maddie said, looking at her watch. "I need to finish these hydrangeas before it gets dark." "Yes, and I have to go home," I said, although the last thing I wanted was to go back. "See you at the construction site?" "If the clients don't choke me with roses," she said with a wink and walked off to her flower bed, waving her trowel. I watched her go, feeling something warm spreading in my chest, and I immediately hated myself for it. She was just a designer, just a woman who made me laugh. But I couldn't let myself think of her that way. Not when my life was a minefield. When I got home, Caitlin was in the living room, flipping through a magazine, her phone lying next to her like a second skin. She looked at me, and I waited for her to ask where I'd been, but she just smiled. "Is it a nice day?" she asked, as if she cared. "Yeah," I said, throwing the keys on the table. "I was walking, drinking coffee. And you? Saving the world in your office?" She snorted, but I saw her fingers twitch toward her phone, probably checking to see if Daniel had texted. I went into the kitchen to get some water, but really I just wanted to get away from her. The file in the safe was burning in my brain. I knew it would be over soon, but this meeting with Maddie, it was like a light at the end of a tunnel, and I was afraid it would go out if I took a step. It had been a week since I'd received the folder containing the evidence of Caitlin's infidelity, and every day had been a minefield. I'd kept my cool like Jack Carter had told me, pretending everything was normal, but it was like swallowing broken glass. Caitlin had kept up her game, smiling at dinner, talking about work, even trying to touch my arm like we were happy. But I knew the truth. The photos, the videos, the texts with Daniel West hidden in the safe were burning my brain. I'd been waiting for the moment to hand her the divorce papers, like Richard's lawyer had said, but every time I looked at her, part of me wanted to just throw the folder in her face and watch her squirm. Friday night, Caitlin announced she was going to another company dinner. I knew it wasn't dinner, it was another date with Daniel, and the thought made my fists itch. Olivia was at a friend's house, and Ethan was at a party with some classmates, so the house was empty except for the two of us. I was in the living room, flipping through channels on the TV, when I heard the click of heels on the stairs. Caitlin came down, and I almost dropped the remote. She was wearing a black dress that clung to her like a second skin, with a neckline that screamed, "Look at me." Her hair was in perfect curls, and her makeup was straight out of a magazine. She looked stunning, and I hated myself for still noticing it. But I knew this wasn't for me. This was for Daniel, her slick boss, who, according to her text messages, was going crazy over her energy. "How do I look?" she asked, spinning around in front of me as if we were a couple in love. I put the remote down, stood up, and looked at her with my arms crossed. My voice was even, but inside I was seething like a volcano. "That's amazing, Kate," I said, and every word was laced with venom. "Daniel will appreciate it. It's for him, right?" Her smile faltered, but she quickly pulled herself together. She had always been a master of dissimulation. "Will, don't start," she said, adjusting her earrings. "This is work. You know how important this project is." "Work," I repeated, grinning in a way that must have made her realize there was something fishy. "Sure. Is it okay if you look like you're going on a date? Or is that part of your job description now?" She rolled her eyes, but I noticed her fingers tighten around her purse. I had hit the nail on the head, and she knew it. "You're unbearable," she said, stepping toward the door. "Maybe you should try trusting me for a change." Trust. I laughed, and it wasn't laughter, but something bitter. "Oh, darling, I trusted you for 20 years. The house, the kids, your $5,000 wardrobe. And what did I get? New perfume and late nights." She froze, looking at me as if I had hit her. But then her face turned cold as ice. "You're paranoid, Will," she said, lowering her voice. "If you feel so bad, why don't you stop me? Or don't you care about your wife?" I took a step closer, and she backed away, leaning against the door. Her words were like a red rag to a bull. She was trying to provoke me to turn everything around, as if I was the one at fault. But I knew the truth, and that made me stronger. "Stop you," I said, looking into her eyes. "Why? You've already made your choice, Kate. I'm just waiting for you to admit it." Her eyes widened, but she didn't say anything. She just stared, like she was trying to figure out if I was bluffing. I could have pulled out the folder right then, shown her the photo of her kissing Daniel, but I remembered Richard's words, "Wait for the moment." That moment was close, but not today. "You don't even want to try," she said, and her voice was quieter, almost plaintive. "You don't even ask where I'm going, why I'm dressed like this. Do you not care at all?" I laughed, and it was a cold, harsh sound. She was playing the victim, and it was so low that I almost admired her audacity. "Don't care," I said, leaning closer. "Oh, Kate, I do care. I know more than you think. Go to your dinner. Have fun. Just don't complain when you get back." She opened her mouth, but said nothing. She simply grabbed her purse and stormed out the door, slamming it so hard that the pictures on the wall shook. I stood there, staring at the closed door, feeling anger mingle with something that felt like relief. She thought she was in control, but she was wrong. I held all the cards, and she would soon find out. I plopped down on the couch and turned on the TV, but I didn't watch. My thoughts were racing through Caitlin, Daniel, that file in the safe. I pictured her laughing with him touching her, and I wanted to break something. But I forced myself to breathe. Jack was right. Don't do anything stupid. Richard was right. Wait for the right moment. I wasn't going to give her a chance to get away with this. An hour later, I got a text from Olivia. "Dad, I'm staying at Claire's." "Okay," I texted back. "Okay, baby. Have fun." Then I texted Ethan, asking when he'd be home. He texted back, "It's late. Don't wait up." I was alone in an empty house, and it was almost nice. No one was asking questions. No one was looking at me like I was a ticking time bomb. I went into the garage, opened the safe, and pulled out the folder, just to make sure it was there. The photo of Caitlin and Daniel was on top, and I forced myself to look. Her smile, his hand on her waist. It was like a punch to the gut, but I didn't look away. I wanted to remember that pain so that when the time came, I wouldn't flinch. I put the folder back and walked back into the living room. My phone was on the table, and I thought about Madison Crowe, about her green eyes, about the way she'd laughed in the park, digging in the dirt. She'd been a silver lining in this shitty tunnel, but I couldn't let myself think about her. Not when I was married to a woman who'd betrayed me. But the thought of Maddie warmed me, and I hated myself for it. I was no better than Caitlin for allowing myself to feel this way. Or was I? Hell, I didn't know. I opened a beer, sat down on the couch, and stared at the TV, which was playing some stupid sitcom. The laughter coming from the speakers sounded as fake as Caitlin's smile. I knew she was with Daniel, probably at the same Marriott where Jack had picked them up. The thought made my fists clench, but I reminded myself, soon. Soon she will find out that I'm not the idiot she thought I was. That night I slept fitfully, waking up every time I heard a noise outside my window. Caitlin came home around 2 in the morning. I heard her car pull into the driveway. She came in quietly, thinking I was asleep, and I didn't try to convince her otherwise. I lay in the dark, listening to her creep into the bedroom, and thought about my dad, about the divorce, about Maddie, and how I was going to get out of this hell even if I had to burn it all down. After that Friday night, when Caitlin went to her office dinner, I knew I couldn't wait any longer. The file containing the evidence of her infidelity sat in the safe like a grenade without a pin, and I was ready to throw it. Richard, the lawyer, had said that the moment had to be perfect for Caitlin to not slip up, and I chose Saturday. Olivia was at a friend's house, Ethan was at a party, and Caitlin was going to another event with her coworkers. I knew it was a lie. She was going to see Daniel West, and the thought was like acid, eating away at me from the inside. But tonight, I was going to put an end to her games. I was sitting in the living room, flipping through the channels on the telly, when I heard the click of her heels on the stairs. She came down, and I nearly gasped. Caitlin was wearing a red dress that cost more than my monthly electric bill. It hugged her like a second skin, with a slit up to her thigh, and she looked like she was about to take on the world. Or, more accurately, Daniel. Her hair was in perfect waves, and her lips were a scarlet gloss, like a warning. I hated that she could still look like that, and I hated myself for noticing. "So, how do you like it?" she asked, spinning around in front of me with a smile that was meant to be flirtatious, but to me was just fake. I put the remote down, stood up, and looked at her with my arms crossed. My voice was cold as ice, but inside I was seething. That's great, Kate, I said, and every word was laced with venom. That's absolutely stunning. Daniel will love it. It's for him, right? Her smile wavered, but she quickly pulled herself together, as always. Will, stop, she said, adjusting her purse. It's just dinner with colleagues. Are you doing this again? Dinner, I repeated, grinning in a way that must have made her feel like I knew more than I was letting on. Of course. Do you always wear a two-penny dress to dinner with coworkers? Or is that a special dress code for the Marriott? Her eyes narrowed, and I saw her clutch her purse. I had hit the nail on the head, and she knew it. But she didn't give up. You're unbearable, she said, stepping toward the door. If you feel so bad, why don't you stop me? Or have you completely forgotten how to be a husband? I laughed, and it was a sharp, cold sound. She was trying to turn it around, like it was my fault she was hanging out with the boss. But I was ready. I had been waiting for this moment, and it had come. Stop you, I said, stepping toward her. Why, Kate? You've already made your choice. But you know what? I have too. I pulled a large white envelope out of my desk drawer with her name written on it in black marker. Her eyes widened, but she didn't move. I stepped closer, holding the envelope like a weapon. What is it? She asked, and there was a fear in her voice I hadn't heard before. Your ticket to a new life, I said, handing her the envelope. Here, and smile, I want to capture this. I pulled out my phone and snapped 3 quick pictures while she held the envelope. She didn't even resist, just looked at me like I was a stranger. Her face was pale, and I almost enjoyed it. Almost. Will, what the hell, she said, clutching the envelope. What's in this? Open it and find out, I said, putting the phone away. But I'll save you some time. These are divorce papers, and proof that you're sleeping with Daniel West. Photos, videos, text messages, everything we need to smear you in court. She froze, and I saw her fingers tremble as she opened the envelope. She pulled out some photos, the ones of her kissing Daniel in the Marriott lobby, and her face went chalk white. You hired a detective? She whispered, looking at me. You were following me? Oh yeah, I said, crossing my arms. And you know what? You paid half his bill yourself. $3,000 from our vacation fund. Thanks for the contribution, dear. She gasped as if I had hit her. I could see her trying to compose herself, her brain searching for a way out, but I wasn't going to give her a chance. You have 2 options, Kate, I said, my voice as hard as concrete. 1, you sign the papers and we get a quiet 50-50 divorce. No one sees these photos except my lawyer. 2, you refuse and we go to court. I take 80% and your dirty deeds are on display for everyone. Your choice. She looked at me and I saw panic flicker in her eyes. She opened her mouth, but the words stuck. Then she did what I expected. She tried to manipulate. Will, you can't do this, she said, her voice soft, almost pleading. We're a family. Olivia, Ethan, you want to ruin everything because of some misunderstanding. Misunderstandings? I laughed, and it was an angry, bitter sound. You call your nights at the Marriott a misunderstanding? You slept with him for 3 months, Kate. Maybe more. Don't lie to me. Not now. She stepped back, clutching the envelope to her chest as if it could protect her. I saw her searching for words, but I wasn't going to listen. Are you serious? She said, her voice shaking. You want a divorce? Just like that, without talking, without a chance to fix it. Fix it. I took a step closer, and she hit the wall. I tried, Kate, dinners, trips, flowers. I did everything to get you back. And you? You chose Daniel, so don't you dare talk about chances. She was silent, and I saw her eyes fill with tears. But I knew that this was also an act. She always knew how to turn on the tears when she needed to. I didn't buy it. You have a week, I said, walking away. Sign or not, I don't care. But if you don't sign, everyone will see these photos. Your parents, your colleagues, your yoga group, and your children, if it comes to court. You wouldn't dare, she whispered, but there was no confidence in her voice. Look at me, Kate, I said, looking into her eyes. I've already dared. I turned and walked into the kitchen, leaving her with the envelope and her panic. My heart was pounding, but I felt a strange sense of relief. I had done it. I had thrown the grenade, and now she would have to deal with the shrapnel. I opened a beer and sat at the table, listening to her pace in the living room. I waited for her to burst in and start screaming or crying, but she just went upstairs. Half an hour later, I heard her car start and she was gone. Probably to Daniel's. Whatever. It didn't matter anymore. The morning after I handed Caitlin the divorce papers was as quiet as the morning before a storm. She came home in the early morning, thinking I was asleep, and I didn't try to dissuade her. I lay in the dark, listening to her creep into the spare bedroom, and felt a strange sense of relief. The envelope containing the evidence of her infidelity had done its job. She knew I wasn't bluffing. But I also knew she wouldn't go down without a fight. Caitlin was a PR woman through and through, and she would try to weasel her way out of this, as she always did. Only this time, I was prepared to block her every avenue. By midday, I was sitting in the kitchen with my coffee when she came downstairs. She didn't look like her usual self, no makeup, an old t-shirt and jeans, dark circles under her eyes. The envelope was on the table in front of her, and I could see she was trying not to look at it. I waited for her to start screaming or crying, but she just sat down across from me and stared into her cup. "Will, we need to talk," she said, her voice quieter than usual. "Talk?" I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. "About what, Kate? About how you slept with Daniel for 3 months? Or about how you paid half of the detective's bill? I'm all ears." She flinched, but didn't look up. I saw her clutching her cup, and I knew she was searching for words to turn it all back on me. But I wasn't going to give her a chance. I didn't mean for this to happen," she said, her voice shaking. "It was a mistake. I was confused. Will, work, stress. Daniel was just there, and you." "What about me?" I snapped, leaning closer. "Worked? Raised children? Paid for your wardrobe? Don't you dare blame it on me, Kate. You made a choice, and now you have to live with it." She was silent, and I saw her eyes fill with tears. But I knew her too well. It was another game. She always turned on the tears when she needed to. I didn't buy it. "I want to finish this," I said, my voice as hard as concrete. "But first, one thing, the rings." I took off my wedding ring and placed it on the table. It jingled, and the sound was like a period at the end of a sentence. I looked at her, waiting for her to do the same. She froze, looking at my ring as if it were poison. "Will, are you serious?" she whispered. "You want to throw away 20 years? "Throw them away?" I laughed, and it was a bitter, cold sound. "You threw them away, Kate, when you crawled into bed with your boss. Go ahead, take them off. Don't make me ask you twice." She slowly took off her rings, her engagement ring, and the one I had given her for our 10th anniversary. Her hands were shaking as she placed them on the table. I took the engagement ring, the one that had belonged to my grandmother, and put it in my pocket. "I'll leave this," I said, "for Olivia or Ethan's future bride, and take yours. I don't need it." She looked at her ring, and I saw her face twist. But she didn't take it. She just sat there, clutching the cup, as if it could keep her world from collapsing. "There's one more thing," I said, taking a piece of paper out of the drawer. "A disclaimer. Sign it." She looked up, and there was a mixture of fear and bewilderment in her eyes. "Refusal," she asked again. "What kind of nonsense is this?" "This is so I won't be held responsible for your adventures," I said, my voice laced with irony. "You're going to Daniel's, right? And judging by your plans, it's not just dinner. I don't want the hospital or the police calling me later if something goes wrong. Sign this, and you're free to do whatever you want." She stared at the paper as if it was written in Chinese. "You think I am like that?" she said, her voice shaking. "Do you really think that I'm capable of something dangerous?" "Kate," I said, looking her in the eye, "I know you're sleeping with a married man who's not afraid to take risks. I know you're lying to my face. So yeah, I think you're capable of a lot. Sign this. She picked up the pen, but her hand froze over the paper. I saw her struggling with pride, with fear, with something else. But then she signed, throwing the pen on the table as if it burned her fingers. Satisfied, she said, and there was anger in her voice, but I knew it was a mask. Not exactly, I said, putting the paper away. One more thing. I'm moving. My things are already packed. The house is yours until we divide the property. But the children, they're going to your parents. Her eyes widened and she jumped up, nearly knocking over her cup. To my parents, she said, you can't just take them away. I'm not taking them, I said, keeping my cool. They'll be safe until we figure this out. I already talked to your mom. She knows you're busy, but I didn't tell her about the photo. Don't thank me. She gasped as if I had hit her. I could see her trying to find words, but her ego was too big to apologize. She just stood there, clenching her fists, looking at me like I was the enemy. Did you tell my mother? She whispered. What did you tell her? Just what was needed, I said. That we were in trouble and the kids were better off with her. Don't worry, I didn't show her the photo shoots of you and Daniel. I'm not like that. She was silent, and I saw her face distorted with pain, anger, and shame. But she didn't say, I'm sorry. She didn't say, I was wrong. Her pride was stronger, and that only convinced me that I was doing the right thing. I'm leaving, Kate, I said, standing up. My tools, my clothes, everything is already in the car. The house is yours. But don't call me unless you're ready to sign the papers. All communication is through a lawyer. I turned to leave, but she grabbed my hand. Her fingers were cold, and I could see she was struggling with herself. Will, wait, she said, her voice almost pleading. We can make this right. For the kids, for us. I looked at her, and for a second I felt sorry for her. But then I remembered the photo, the correspondence, her lies, and that pity disappeared. We're gone, Kate, I said, shaking her hand off. You killed us. Goodbye. I walked out of the kitchen, picked up the bag I had packed that morning, and left. She didn't follow me. She didn't scream, she didn't cry. She just stood there, and I heard her cup clink as she set it down on the table. That was the last sound I heard from her. I got in my car, started the engine, and pulled out of the driveway. My heart was pounding, but I felt lighter than I had in months. I had done it. I had broken free. The file was still in the safe, but Caitlin had the papers, and she knew I wasn't bluffing. She could sign them or fight them, but I was prepared for either outcome. I stopped by Caitlin's parents' house to pick up Olivia and Ethan. They already knew something was wrong. I'd told them that morning that my mom and I were taking a break. Olivia rolled her eyes, but I could tell she was angry. Ethan just nodded, but his face was stony. I didn't tell them about Daniel. I didn't show them the photo. They deserved better than to know what their mother was like. Dad, are you okay? Olivia asked as we drove to her grandmother's. Yeah, baby, I said, smiling into the rearview mirror. I will now. She chuckled, but didn't argue. Ethan was silent, looking out the window. I knew they felt betrayed, but I couldn't protect them from everything. Only the worst. The morning after I left Caitlin with the divorce papers and the rejection was the first time I woke up without a weight on my chest. I'd moved into a motel on the outskirts of Savannah, a cheap place with thin walls and the smell of old cigarettes, but it was mine. For the first time in years, I wasn't sharing space with her lies. Olivia and Ethan were with her parents, and I knew they were okay, even if they were angry at both of us. I didn't blame them. I was angry, too, at Caitlin, at myself, at 20 years that now seemed like a waste of time. But I also felt something new, freedom. It was fragile as glass, but it felt so damn good. I was sitting in my hotel room, drinking lousy coffee from a vending machine and scrolling through my phone when it rang. The number was unfamiliar, but I answered, thinking it might be Richard, my lawyer. Will Harper, I said, putting down my mug. Hi, it's Madison. The voice on the other end was warm as sunlight, and I nearly choked on my coffee. Remember me? The hippie with the shovel from the park? I smiled, and it was the first thing I did all day without effort. It's hard to forget, I said, leaning back on the creaky bed. How are your hydrangeas? Oh, they still want to kill me, she said, and I heard her laugh. But I'm not calling about flowers. I'm on a day off, and I thought, maybe you'd like to go for a ride. There's a place on the coast that serves the best shrimp in Georgia. My treat. I froze, staring at the peeling ceiling. Madison Crowe was asking me out on a date. No, not a date, just a hangout. But it was still more than I deserved until my marriage was officially dead. I wanted to say yes, but Caitlin's voice in my head, her accusations, her tears made me hesitate. Maddie, that's cool, but... I started, but she interrupted. No pressure, Will, she said, her voice as light as the wind. Just shrimp and chat. If you're busy, I understand. I thought about the folder in the safe and about Caitlin, who was probably talking to Daniel right now, trying to figure out how to get around me. And I thought about Maddie, her green eyes, the way she made me laugh when I thought I'd forgotten how. Screw it. The shrimps sound tempting, I said, my voice lighter than I expected. When and where? Cool, she said, and I heard her clap her hands. I'll pick you up in an hour. Where are you? I gave her the motel address, feeling like an idiot for living in a dump for $40 a night. But she didn't comment, just said, I'll be right there. I hung up and stared at the phone as if it could explain what I'd just done. Madison Crowe. Shit, I wasn't ready for this, but I couldn't back out now. I had time to shower and put on a clean shirt when I heard a knock on the door. I opened it, expecting to see Maddie, but it was Caitlin standing there. She was wearing the same t-shirt as yesterday, her hair was disheveled, and her eyes were red from lack of sleep. My stomach dropped, but I forced myself to stand up straight. What are you doing here? I asked, crossing my arms. I said everything through a lawyer. Will, I just want to talk, she said, her voice hoarse, like she'd been crying. Please, give me 5 minutes. I wanted to slam the door, but something about the look of her, not the makeup, not the dress, just her, broken, made me back away. 5 minutes, I said, letting her in. But don't expect me to change my mind. She walked in, looking around the motel like it was a dump. I sat on the edge of the bed. She remained standing, clutching her purse like a life preserver. I don't want a divorce, she said, looking at the floor. I know I screwed up. With Daniel, it was a mistake. I'm done with him. We can start over for the kids. I laughed, and it was a cold, harsh sound. She looked up, and I could see she was trying to control herself. Start over, I said, standing up. Kate, you slept with him for 3 months. You lied to my face. You think I'm just going to forget it because you said mistake? Do you even realize how low you've sunk? She opened her mouth, but I didn't let her speak. And don't you dare mention the children, I said, stepping closer. They're with your parents because I don't want them to see their mother ruin the family. You've lost the right to talk about them. Her eyes filled with tears, but I knew it was her usual game. She always turned on the tears when she needed to. But I was made of stone. Will I? She started, but my phone rang and I raised my hand to shut her up. I answered without taking my eyes off her. It was Maddie. Hey, I'm at the motel, she said, her voice like a breath of air. Are you ready? Yeah, I'll be right out, I said, smiling despite Caitlin, who was looking at me like I was a traitor. Are you alone, or is your gang with you? Maddie laughed, and the sound was like medicine. Alone for now, but Ruby and Mom want to come along, she said. They think you're cute. Mom especially. She said you're her type. I almost choked, but I laughed. Your mom? Seriously? I said, shaking my head. I think I'm screwed. Should I take some stamina pills? Maddie giggled, and I saw Caitlin tense up, listening to every word. Her face was flushed, and I knew she was listening. So be it. I didn't care. Don't worry, I'll cover them, Maddie said. But Ruby's already planning a photo shoot on the beach. She says you're photogenic. Photogenic, I said, grinning. Is that a hint that I should pose? Tell her I charge extra for that. We chatted for another minute, and I hung up, feeling lighter than I had all day. Caitlin looked at me, her eyes full of anger and something else, jealousy. Really? After everything she'd done? Who was that? She asked, her voice sharp as a knife. Nobody that concerns you, I said, grabbing the keys. You have to go, Kate. I'm busy. Busy? She stepped closer, and I saw her fists clench. You're leaving me for some easy woman? You didn't even give us a chance. I laughed, and it was genuine. She was jealous. She, who had slept with Daniel, who had lied to me for months, was now blaming me. It was so low, it was almost genius. A woman of easy virtue, I said, looking her in the eye. Careful, Kate, you're describing yourself. And don't you dare talk about chances. You've blown them. Now get out of here before I call security. She gasped as if I had hit her, but I could see her ego struggling with the urge to scream. She wanted to take back control, but I wasn't going to give it to her. Give. That's it, she said, her voice shaking. You're just going to leave? To her? Yes, I said, opening the door. And you know what? This is going to be the best day I've had in years. Goodbye, Kate. I walked out, leaving her in the room. She didn't follow me, and I didn't look back. Maddie was waiting by her truck, wearing jeans and a t-shirt, the same straw hat she'd worn in the park. She smiled, and I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. Ready for shrimp? She asked, starting the engine. Her straw hat was on the back seat, and in a t-shirt and jeans, she looked like she had escaped from a farm, but damn cute. I'm ready for anything, I said, and it was more honest than I wanted. Where's the place with the best shrimp? Tybee Island, she said, pulling out onto the road. Little diner by the beach. Nothing special, but they have shrimp that'll make you forget your name. I chuckled, looking out the window. Savannah flashed past the glass moss-covered oak trees, old houses, tourists with phones. I tried to focus on the road, but thoughts of Caitlin, her jealousy, the folder and the safe were still spinning in my head. As if sensing this, Maddie turned on the radio, and old rock filled the car. It helped. A little. We drove to her house on the outskirts of town, a pretty cottage with a garden overgrown with flowers that she appeared to have planted herself. She parked and nodded toward the door. Come on in and I'll introduce you to the gang, she said, grinning. Just don't be scared. They're peculiar. Peculiar? I asked again, getting out of the car. Is this supposed to be an escape for me? Maybe, she said with a wink, but I'll cover you. I followed her in and immediately felt like I was in another world. The living room was littered with books, cameras, and weird figurines, like someone was trying to set up a hippie museum. On the couch sat a girl in her 30s, with short dark hair and an eyebrow piercing. She was leafing through a magazine, but looked up when we entered. Ruby, this is Will, Maddie said, nodding at me. Will, this is my sister. Don't let her take your picture. Ruby smirked, looking me up and down as if I were a painting at auction. Hey, Will, she said, holding out her hand. Maddie wasn't lying. You're really cool. Ready for a photo shoot? Only if I get paid, I said, shaking her hand. Her grip was firm, and her eyes were the same green as Maddie's, but with a sparkle that screamed, I'm going to cause chaos. Oh, I can pay in shrimp, she said with a wink. Or beer. Which would you choose? Beer, I said, and we both laughed. But I noticed the way she looked at me, not just in a friendly way, but with a hint of something. Damn, that was unexpected. Before I could process what was happening, a woman came out of the kitchen and my jaw dropped. It was Helen, Maddie and Ruby's mother, but she didn't look a day over 40. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a high ponytail, and her dress, a flowy, floral one, hugged a figure that I hadn't noticed because, well, it was Maddie's mom. But she moved with such energy, like she was about to rock the party. Will, huh? She said, holding out her hand. Ellen Crow. Maddie said you build houses. That's hot. I shook her hand, trying not to look stunned. Thanks, I said. I try not to drop beans on customers." She laughed, and her laugh was loud and infectious like Maddie's. But then she leaned closer, and I felt my neck flush. "You know, Will," she said, lowering her voice, "a man who works with his hands is always my type. Keep at it, will you?" I almost choked, but Maddie rolled her eyes and nudged her mother. "Mom, that's enough," she said, but her voice was full of laughter. "Don't scare him. He hasn't tried shrimp yet." "I'm just being honest," Helen said, winking at me. "At my age, it's possible." Ruby snorted, and I tried to think of something to say that wouldn't make me look like an idiot. Maddie saved me by grabbing my arm. "Let's go before they start adopting you," she said, pulling me toward the door. "Or something else," Ruby added, and her grin was such that I felt like prey. We got out, and I got into the truck, still processing this circus. Maddie started the engine, glancing at me. "I warned you," she said, grinning. "They're harmless, but, well, you get the idea." "Get it?" I said, shaking my head. "Your mom just called me hot. I don't know what to make of that." "Take it as a compliment," she said, laughing. "She just likes to flirt. And Ruby, she always does. But they want to come to Tybee with us. Is that okay with you?" "Against?" I raised an eyebrow. "Your sister and mother, who seem ready to take me apart. Sounds like an adventure." She laughed, and I felt the tension drain away. But inside, I was confused. I liked Maddie, her laugh, her easygoing manner, her green eyes. But Ruby and Helen were confusing. Their flirting was playful, but I didn't know where the line was. And I was still married, for fuck's sake. The marriage might be dead, but the ring on Caitlin's finger still hung over me like a ghost. We drove to Tybee in an hour, chatting about random stuff, her dislike of plastic lawns, my client who wanted a house shaped like a boat. The place was just as Maddie had described, small, with peeling paint and the smell of fried shrimp that had been wafting through our noses since the parking lot. We sat at a table by the window, overlooking the ocean, and ordered a plate of shrimp and a beer. "So," Maddie said, taking a bite of shrimp, "you still haven't told me what's been eating you. Family matters." I froze, looking at the beer. I didn't want to drag her into this shit, but her eyes were so sincere that I couldn't lie. "The marriage is falling apart," I said, shrugging. "My wife, let's say she found a hobby. I'm trying to figure it out." She nodded without pressing, and it was like a bomb. "It's harsh," she said. "But you know, sometimes you have to burn everything to build something new. Like in a garden, you pull out the weeds so the flowers can grow." "You're quite the philosopher," I said, grinning. "Maybe I should get a shovel, too." "Only if you're willing to dig," she said with a wink. "But seriously, Will, if you want to talk, I'm here." I nodded but didn't elaborate. Instead, we chatted about a trip to Tybee she was planning with Ruby and Helen. She wanted to show me some secret spot on the beach where I could find palm-sized shells. "Ruby's going to take pictures of everything," she said, rolling her eyes. "And Mom's probably going to dance under the moon. Are you ready for that?" "Dancing under the moon," I said, laughing. "I might not survive. Your mother already looks at me like I'm dessert." "Oh, she's just teasing," Maddie said, but her cheeks were flushed. "But if anything happens, I'll save you." We laughed, and I felt the weight of the last few weeks lift. But deep down, I knew I wasn't ready for this, for Maddie, for her family, for these sparks I couldn't ignore. I wanted to be with her, but Ruby and Helen were confusing, and Caitlin's shadow still hung over me. I was at a crossroads, and every step seemed like a minefield. By the time we got back to Savannah, the sun had set. Maddie dropped me off at the motel, and I watched her truck disappear into the darkness. I knew this trip to Tybee was going to be about more than just shrimp, and I didn't know if I was up for it. But damn, I wanted to try. After meeting Madison and her crazy family, I returned to the motel feeling like I just escaped from the circus. Ruby and her brazen flirting and Helen and her compliments had thrown me off, but Maddie, her laugh, her green eyes was like a magnet. I knew I shouldn't feel this way until my divorce from Caitlin was final, but I couldn't stop myself. She was a breath of fresh air after months of suffocation. But I also knew Caitlin wouldn't give up easily. She'd signed the release, but the look in her eyes, filled with anger and tears, told me she was still trying to claw at me. I was ready to call it quits, and today was the day. I sat in my hotel room, looking at the bag I'd packed that morning. Most of my things were already with a friend who'd agreed to keep them until I found an apartment. The motel was a temporary refuge, but I wasn't planning on staying here long. I was waiting for the cab that was supposed to pick me up in half an hour to meet Maddie. But first, I had one thing to finish. I pulled out the small box I'd bought at the drugstore yesterday from my bag. Yes, it was a cheap, poisonous trick, but I couldn't resist. Caitlin deserved a parting gift that would remind her of who she was. I drove to her house now, until we split the property. Caitlin's car was in the driveway, and I knew she was home. Olivia and Ethan were at her parents', so no one would interrupt. I knocked on the door, and she opened it almost immediately, like she'd been expecting me. She was wearing the same old t-shirt. Her hair was wild, and she had no makeup on. Her eyes were red, like she'd been crying, but I wasn't buying that. "Will," she said, her voice hoarse, "have you come to talk?" "Not exactly," I said, entering uninvited. "I came to say goodbye." She froze, looking at me as if I were speaking another language. I walked into the living room, where the scent of her perfume, the same one she wore for Daniel, still lingered. The envelope with the divorce papers lay on the table, untouched, as I had expected. "You haven't signed," I said, nodding at the envelope. "It's been almost a week, Kate. Do you really think you can drag it out?" She clenched her fists, but didn't look away. I haven't decided yet," she said, her voice shaking. "Will, this is too soon. We can try, for the children's sake." I laughed, and it was a cold, harsh sound that echoed in the empty living room. "The kids," I said, stepping closer. "Did you think about them when you kissed Daniel at the Marriott? Or when you texted him how he was driving you crazy? Don't lie to me, Kate. Your guilt won't wash away this shit." Her face turned pale, and I saw that she was struggling with herself. She wanted to say something, but I didn't give her a chance. "I didn't come to argue," I said, taking the box out of my pocket. "This is for you, a parting gift." I threw the box on the table, and it landed with a soft thud. Caitlin looked at it, and her eyes widened as she realized what it was. I picked the cheapest one with the silly label so the hit would be more accurate. "Seriously, Will," she said, her voice a mixture of anger and shame. "You've stooped to this?" "Dropped," I said, grinning in a way that must have been poisonous to her. "Oh, my dear, you dropped it when you went to bed with your boss. Use it, Kate. I'm sure you'll find it useful." She gasped as if I had hit her. I saw her eyes fill with tears, but they were not the kind of tears that would hurt me. It was her usual game, to play the victim, to make me feel guilty. But I was made of stone. "You're a bastard," she whispered, clenching her fists. "Maybe," I said, shrugging. "But I'm not the one who lied for 20 years. Sign the papers, Kate, or I'll sign them myself in court, and you'll lose everything." I turned toward the door, but she grabbed my hand. Her fingers were cold, and I could see her struggling with herself, pride versus fear, guilt versus anger. "Will, wait," she said, her voice almost pleading. "I know I screwed up, but I still love you." I froze, looking at her. Love? Seriously? After everything she had done, the photos, the texts, the nights at the Marriott? I wanted to laugh, but instead I just shook her hand off. "Love?" I said, my voice cold as ice. "You don't know what this is, Kate. You love yourself and your games. Goodbye." I walked out without looking back. She didn't follow me, and I didn't hear her cry. Just silence, heavy as concrete. I got into a cab waiting outside the house and gave the address of the diner where I'd agreed to meet Maddie. My heart was pounding, but I felt lighter than I'd ever felt. I left Caitlin with her guilt, her lies, and her stupid gift. She could keep it as a souvenir of her failure. In the cab, I stared out the window, watching Savannah flash by old houses, moss-covered oak trees, streetlights. I thought about Maddie, her laugh, the way she dug in the dirt, not caring what anyone thought. I thought about Ruby and Helen, their shocking flirtation that baffled me. But most of all, I thought about how, for the first time in years, I was free. Not quite the divorce was still pending, but free of her chains. When the taxi pulled up to the diner, I saw Maddie sitting at a table outside. She was wearing jeans and a t-shirt with the same straw hat and was drinking lemonade, watching the people pass by. I got out of the car and she smiled, waving at me. 2 whole minutes late, she said with a wink. That's -1 for punctuality. Sorry, I was busy, I said, sitting down opposite. I was handing out presents. She raised an eyebrow but didn't ask. Instead, she slid the menu towards me. Shrimp or burger, she asked. Choose quickly, I'm hungry. Shrimp, I said, grinning. Leaving Caitlin felt like a slab of concrete had been lifted off my shoulders. My heart was still pounding with anger, but every mile Madison and I drove on the road to Tybee Island took me further from the life I'd left behind. Maddie sat behind the wheel of her truck, humming along to the radio, and I watched the marshes and palm trees flash by, trying not to think about Caitlin. Olivia and Ethan were with her parents, and I knew they were okay, but I still felt a twinge of guilt for not telling them the truth. They deserved better than a mother who lied and a father who hid. But today, I just wanted to breathe. Ruby and Helen had joined us at the last minute, and now they were sitting in the back seat, arguing about whose music was better, Helen's old rock or Ruby's indie rock. I tried not to laugh, but their bickering was like a free show. Mom, your Led Zeppelin is for dinosaurs, Ruby said, pointing at her phone. Play something normal. Dinosaurs, Helen snorted, adjusting her oversized sunglasses. Girl, I danced to this before you were born. Will, back me up. I'm for neutrality, I said, grinning. But if you choose Metallica, I don't mind. Maddie laughed, glancing at me. Oh, you're a metalhead, she said, raising an eyebrow. I didn't expect that. I'm full of surprises, I said, and it was more honest than I intended. We got to Tybee around noon, and the air smelled of salt and sun. The shrimp place we'd gone to the last time was closed, so Maddie led us to a beach she called the secret spot. It was a narrow stretch of sand surrounded by dunes, with shells scattered around like treasure. Ruby immediately pulled out her camera and started clicking away, as if we were on a movie set. Will, stand up straight, she said, aiming the lens. You're photogenic, come on, show off your skills. I build houses, I don't pose, I said, but I smiled anyway because her energy was infectious. Oh, don't be a bore, she said with a wink. I'll make a star out of you. Her flirting was light, but I could feel it unsettling. She was like Maddie's same green eyes, same laugh, but with a sharp edge, like a knife that could cut if you weren't careful. I glanced at Maddie, who was laying out the blanket, and felt a pang of guilt. I liked her, not Ruby, but these games were driving me crazy. Helen, meanwhile, had kicked off her sandals and was walking toward the water, her flowered dress fluttering in the wind. She looked like she was ready to dance, just like Maddie had promised. Will, come here, she called, waving her hand. The water is as warm as a bath. I don't swim in a dress, I said, but I moved closer because I didn't want to be the guy sitting on the sidelines. Maddie joined us, and the three of us waded through the shallows, collecting shells. Ruby clicked away, yelling at us to look natural. I tried not to think about Caitlin, about my dad, about the divorce, but it was like a shadow following me. Maddie, as if she sensed it, touched my arm. Are you okay? She asked, lowering her voice. You look like you're thinking about taxes. Worse, I said, grinning. But I'll cope. I'm just glad to be here. She smiled, and I felt something warm spread in my chest. But then Ruby jumped up, holding a huge shell. Will, look, she said, thrusting it under my nose. This is for you if you promise to dance with us tonight. Dance, I said, raising an eyebrow. I build houses, I don't dance. And with whom we? With me, with Maddie, with Mom, she said, winking so hard I almost choked. We're crows, we don't let you get bored. Helen laughed as she came closer. She's right, Will, she said, adjusting her glasses. Life's too short to sit in a corner. When I was your age, I danced until the early hours, even when my marriage was going down the drain. I froze, looking at her. Her voice was light, but there was some depth to it, as if she knew what she was talking about. Your marriage? I asked, unable to resist. She sighed, looking out at the ocean, and her smile grew quieter. Yes, she said. My husband was complicated, good, but messed up. I loved him, but he cheated, lied, and eventually I left. That was 20 years ago. Best decision of my life. I nodded, feeling her words hit home. She didn't know about Caitlin, but her story was like a mirror. I wanted to ask more, but Maddie interrupted. Mom, don't start, she said, rolling her eyes. Will came for shrimp, not family drama. Oh, I can do both, Helen said, winking at me. You can handle it, can't you? I'll try, I said, and we all laughed. We spent the day at the beach, eating sandwiches Maddie had brought and drinking beer from a cooler. Ruby kept teasing me, sometimes asking if I should take a picture for my portfolio, sometimes joking that I should show off my muscles. Ellen played along, telling stories of her old parties where she'd party until the wee hours. Maddie just smiled, but I could see the way she was looking at me, not in a flirtatious way like Ruby, but with something real, and it scared me. That evening, we lit a fire on the beach, and Maddie sat next to me, watching the flames. Ruby and Helen danced to music on the portable speaker, and I couldn't help but smile. But inside, I was in turmoil. I liked Maddie, her laugh, her ease, her ability to make me forget about Caitlin. But what if that was just an escape? What if I was clinging to her to keep from drowning in pain? I was still married, damn it, even if it was only on paper. And these feelings for Maddie, for this new life, were a minefield. Are you thinking about taxes again? Maddie asked, bumping her shoulder into mine. Something worse, I said, looking at the fire. But you make it easier. She smiled and her hand touched mine for a second. Okay, she said, because I don't want you to be a zombie on our trip. A trip? I asked again, raising an eyebrow. Yeah, she said, grinning. Ruby, Mom, and I are going to Tybee for the weekend. Are you coming? I looked at her, then at Ruby, who winked at me as she danced, and at Helen, who raised her glass in my direction. My heart sank. I wanted to say yes, but part of me was afraid I was just running from pain, not toward something new. Let me think, I said, and I meant it. But I certainly won't miss the shrimp. She laughed. Kate. After Will left and abandoned me, the house became like a mausoleum, silent, cold, and haunted. I sat in the living room, staring at the box he'd thrown on the table, and felt my world crumble. The photos, the videos, the texts with Daniel, he knew everything. I thought I'd been careful, that he'd never figure it out, but I was wrong. Will, the one I thought was predictable, had hired a detective and squashed me like a bug. And the worst part was, I couldn't blame him. But I did anyway. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in our now mine bedroom, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out how it had all come to this. Daniel had been a mistake, I knew that. He had been charismatic, controlling, telling me I was special, that I deserved more than just being a wife and mother, and I bought it. His words, his touch at the Marriott, it had been a drug that had dulled my boredom, my weariness at living a life where I was a shadow of myself. But now, with that envelope on the table, I could see that it wasn't freedom. It was a cage I had built for myself. I drove to the office that morning, hoping work would distract me. But as soon as I walked in, I felt the eyes. Coworkers who usually smiled and chatted were now whispering behind my back. I heard a snatch of conversation in the coffee area. Did you see her with Daniel at the party? They weren't exactly hiding. My face was burning, but I held my head high. I was Caitlin Harper, the PR person who could sell ice to Eskimos. I wasn't going to show that I was broken. I walked into Daniel's office to talk. He was sitting at his desk, flipping through papers, looking like nothing had happened. I closed the door and looked at him. "We need to talk," I said, trying to keep my voice even. He looked up, his smile as slippery as ever. "Kate, what's all this drama?" he said, leaning back in his chair. "You look like you lost your contract." "Will knows," I said, my voice shaking. "He hired a detective. He has photos, videos, correspondence. He filed for divorce." His smile disappeared, and I saw his face harden. "So," he said, shrugging, "that's your problem, Kate. I didn't sign up for a family feud." I froze, feeling my blood run cold. "My problem?" I asked, stepping closer. "You said I was special. You said we—" "Oh, come on," he snapped, standing up. "It was just fun. You didn't think I'd leave my wife for you, did you? I have my own life, Kate. Deal with yours." I stood there as if he had hit me. Fun? All these months, all these nights when I had risked everything, my family, my children, my reputation, were just a game to him. I wanted to scream, to grab his face, but I just turned and walked out, because I knew that if I stayed, I would burst into tears, and I was not going to give him that satisfaction. At the office, the gossip grew louder. I could hear coworkers whispering in the hallway. She slept with the boss. Her husband filed for divorce. My world that I had so carefully built, the perfect career, the perfect image, was collapsing like a house of cards. I locked myself in my office, trying to focus on work, but every time I opened my laptop, the photo from the envelope would pop into my head. Will knew, and he wasn't about to forgive. By evening, I couldn't take it anymore and called Olivia. I wanted to hear her voice. I wanted her to tell me everything would be okay. But when she answered, her tone was cold as ice. "What, Mom?" she said, and I could hear the TV in the background. She was at my parents', and I knew they knew too. Will said he hadn't shown them the photo, but I could feel their judgment, even through the phone. "Olivia, I just wanted to check in on you," I said, trying to sound normal. "I'm fine," she said, her voice sharp. "What about you? Having fun with Daniel?" I gasped, like she'd hit me. She knew. Not all, but enough. "Olivia, this isn't—" I started, but she interrupted. "Forget it, Mom. Dad said you're breaking up. I don't want to discuss it." She hung up, and I sat there, staring at the phone, tears stinging my eyes. I called Ethan, but he didn't answer. I texted him, "Please talk to me," but he left the message on read. My children, my babies I'd rocked in my arms, now looked at me like I didn't belong, and I couldn't blame them. But I still blamed Will. I came home to an empty house, where every corner reminded me of him. The way we laughed, the way he fixed my bike, the way he looked at me when he thought I wasn't looking. I wanted to hate him, but I couldn't. I hated myself. I sat on the couch, holding the envelope I'd never fully opened, thinking about how it had all gone wrong. I wanted more: a career, freedom, passion. Daniel had given me that, or so I thought. But now I had nothing: no husband, no children, no reputation. I opened the envelope and pulled out a single photo. Me and Daniel in the lobby of the Marriott. I was laughing, his arm around my waist. I had felt alive then, but now it seemed pathetic. I threw the photo on the table and cried, allowing myself to do so for the first time in weeks. But the tears didn't help. They only made the pain worse. I wanted to call Will, to beg him to come back, to tell him I would change. But I knew he wouldn't believe me. He was right. I had made a choice, and now I had to live with him. I blamed him. I blamed Daniel. I blamed the coworkers who whispered behind my back. But deep down, I knew it was me, and that was the worst part. That night, I lay in bed, staring into the darkness, thinking about what I'd lost. Olivia and Ethan were at my parents', and I didn't know when they'd want to see me. Will was gone, his words, "You killed us," echoing in my head. Daniel had abandoned me like trash, and my career, the one I'd risked everything for, was now hanging in the balance. I was alone, and it wasn't liberation, it was punishment. I stood up, walked into the living room, and picked up the box Will had left behind. I wanted to throw it at the wall, but instead I just held it, looking at the stupid label. It was his final blow, his way of saying, "You got what you wanted." And I couldn't argue. I got it. But it wasn't what I wanted. Will. After a day on Tybee with Madison, Ruby, and Helen, I returned to the motel feeling like I could breathe for the first time in months. Their laughter, their wild energy, their shrimp, it was like an antidote to the poison Caitlin had been pumping into me for years. But the shadow of her lies still hung over me. I knew she was struggling with guilt, with loneliness, with the collapse of her perfect life, but I didn't care. She had made her choice, and I had made mine. I had left her with divorce papers and stupid lube and her own reflection. Now I wanted to move on, but part of me was afraid that I was just running from pain instead of building something new. Madison asked me out to dinner that night, and I accepted without giving myself time to change my mind. We met at a little dive on River Street that served fried fish and beer in frosted mugs. She was wearing a light dress without her straw hat, and her hair fell around her shoulders as if she wasn't trying to be perfect. That was what I liked about her. She wasn't pretending like Caitlin. "You look better than last time," she said, sipping her beer. "Has the beach done you any good?" "The beach, shrimp, and your crazy family," I said, grinning. "I almost ran away when your mom started talking about dancing under the moon." She laughed, and the sound was like music. "You can't stop Mom," she said. "But you were great." Even Ruby was impressed. "Ruby?" I raised an eyebrow. She was looking at me like I was a steak. I didn't know whether to pose or run. Maddie giggled, but then her look became more serious. "Will, I know you've got stuff going on," she said, lowering her voice. "If you want to talk, I'm here. If not, beer and fish will do just fine." I looked at her, and something inside me clicked. She wasn't pushing or playing or trying to get drama out of me. She was just real, and I wanted to be like that too. I put my beer down and leaned in closer. "My marriage is dead," I said, my voice even despite the lump in my throat. "My wife cheated on me with my boss. I filed for divorce. That's the whole story." She nodded, not looking away. "It's harsh," she said. "But you're here, not there. That means something." "Maybe," I said with a shrug. "Or maybe I'm just running from shit." "Running away is also a step," she said, smiling. "The main thing is that it's in the right direction." We chatted until midnight when the joint started closing. I told her about my job, how I love building houses that don't use a ton of energy. She told me about a client who wanted a garden like Versailles, but on a budget of $200. We laughed, and I felt the weight of the last few months lift. When we stepped outside, the air was warm, smelling of the river and salt. Maddie looked at me, and I knew this was the moment. "Want to go for a walk?" she asked, nodding toward the embankment. "Unless you make me dance like your mother," I said, and she laughed. We walked down River Street, the lights reflecting off the water, and chatted about nothing. But then she stopped, looking out at the river, and her voice grew quieter. "Will, I don't want to pry," she said, "but I like you, and I don't want to be just. A rebound, you know." I froze, feeling her words hit home. A rebound. I was afraid of the same thing that I was clinging to her to forget Caitlin. But looking at her green eyes, at her sincerity, I knew that wasn't true, or wanted to believe that it wasn't true. "You're not a rebound," I said, and I meant it. "But I don't know if I'm ready. My marriage isn't buried yet." She nodded, not offended. "Then let's just walk," she said, taking my hand. "No rush." We got to her house, and she invited me in. I knew what that meant, and part of me screamed at me to leave. But I didn't. We spent the night together, and it wasn't just sex, it was life coming back to me. Her touch, her laughter, her warmth, it was all real, unlike Caitlin's fakeness. But when I woke up next to her in the morning, the fear was back. What if I was just lying to myself? What if I wasn't ready to trust? We were drinking coffee in her kitchen when Ruby burst in with her laptop like a hurricane. "Will, you're not going to believe this," she said, plopping down in her chair. I've been digging about your friend Daniel West. He's not just Maddie's boss, he's in deep shit. I froze, looking at her. What friend? I said, trying to keep my voice even. And what kind of shit? Ruby grinned like a cat that had caught a mouse. I'm writing a story for the local paper, she said. Daniel West, your PR boss, got caught up in a kickback scheme. He took money for contracts his company didn't fulfill. I have documents, correspondence, even a couple of audio files. If this gets published, he'll go to jail. Maddie looked at me, and I could see she knew who Daniel was. I told her about Caitlin's affair, but I didn't mention his name. Now she put two and two together. Wait, Maddie said, frowning. This is the guy that, you know? Yeah, I said, and my voice was cold. That's the one. Ruby raised an eyebrow, but didn't ask. Well, if he's done something to you, she said, he'll soon have no time for romance. This article will tear his career to shreds. I nodded, feeling strangely satisfied. Daniel deserved it. But I also felt a twinge of guilt. I didn't want Maddie and Ruby getting caught up in my drama. This was my shit, not theirs. Don't get involved, I told Ruby. He's slippery. He might hit back. Oh, I'm not afraid, she said, grinning. I have sources, and they're ironclad. Besides, I'm Crow. We won't give up. Maddie rolled her eyes, but smiled. Ruby, don't start, she said. Will's already in enough trouble. I can handle it, I said, and it was true. But, thank you, Ruby. This is unexpected. Please, she said with a wink, consider it a gift. We drank coffee, and I felt something shift. Daniel was part of the past I'd left behind. Caitlin was there too, with her guilt and her lies. And Maddie, Ruby, this house, it was a future I wanted to try. But the fear was still there. I was afraid to trust, afraid I'd get burned again. But looking at Maddie, at her smile, I decided to take a step. I'm with you on Tybee, I said, looking at her. For the weekend, if your mom won't make me dance. She laughed and her hand touched mine. We agreed, she said, but I can't promise anything about Mom. I smiled, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could move on. Caitlin, Daniel, the divorce, that was the past. But Maddie was the present, and maybe the future. I didn't know if it would work, but I was willing to try. On Monday morning, Richard called to say that Caitlin was ready to meet. She agreed to sign the papers, but she wanted to talk in person. I wasn't eager to see her, but this was the last step. The last point in what I once thought was my 20 years. I arranged to meet her at Richard's office in downtown Savannah, a gray building that smelled of coffee and old papers. Olivia and Ethan were still at her parents', and I hadn't told them about the meeting. They knew we were breaking up, but I didn't want to drag them into this shit. They deserved better. I arrived first and sat in Richard's office, leafing through a magazine I had no interest in. Richard, with his bald head and bushy eyebrows, looked like he was preparing to preach. Are you sure you want to be here? He asked, adjusting his glasses. I can handle everything without you. I do, I said, putting the magazine down. I have to finish this. Face to face. He nodded without arguing. 10 minutes later, Caitlin walked in. She looked different than before, without her perfect makeup, wearing a plain gray suit, her hair pulled back into a tight bun. Her eyes were red, as if she hadn't slept, and I felt a pang of something not pity, but something close. She sat down across from me, holding the envelope of papers I'd handed her. Will, she said, her voice quiet, almost broken. I'll sign, but can we talk? I looked at Richard, and he nodded, walking out of the office. We were alone, and I crossed my arms, waiting for her to speak. Speak, I said, and my voice was colder than I expected. She swallowed, looking at the envelope. I know I messed up, she said, her fingers tightening on the papers. Daniel was a mistake. I thought he'd give me something I didn't have. But I lost you. I lost the kids. I was an idiot. I was silent, looking at her. Part of me wanted to believe that she was sincere, but I knew her too well. She always knew how to say the right thing when she needed to. But now it didn't work. "Are you done?" I said, my voice as flat as concrete. "Because I've heard this before. You talked about the mistake, about the kids, but you haven't changed, Kate. You're just sorry you got caught." Her eyes filled with tears, but I did not look away. She wanted to make me feel guilty, but I was made of stone. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she said, her voice shaking. "But I want you to know that I loved you. Maybe not in the right way, but I loved you, and I'm sorry." I laughed, and it was a cold, bitter sound. "Love," I said, leaning closer. "You call it love when you lie to my face, when you slept with Daniel while I was raising our children. Don't you dare talk about love, Kate. You killed her." She flinched as if I had struck her, but she didn't look away. I could see her struggling with guilt, with pride, with the desire to say something that would bring me back. But I was too far gone. "Sign it," I said, nodding at the papers, "and let's finish this." She nodded, slowly opened the envelope, and picked up a pen. Her hand shook as she signed, and I watched the ink fall onto the paper as if it were the end of a lifetime. She signed all the copies, put the pen down, and looked at me. "Is that all?" she asked, her voice empty. "That's all," I said, standing up. "Goodbye, Kate. Don't call me. Never." I walked out without looking back. Richard was waiting in the hallway, and I nodded for him to finish the paperwork. My heart was pounding, but I felt lighter than I had in a long time. 20 years of ashes, but I was ready for the light. I drove to Madison's cottage with its overgrown garden. She was in the backyard, digging in a flower bed, as usual, with mud on her jeans and a straw hat on her head. She smiled when she saw me, and I felt the tension melt away. "Hey, you're early," she said, wiping her hands. "Everything okay?" "Now, yes," I said, sitting down on the porch. "The divorce is signed. I'm free." She nodded without asking questions and sat down next to me. Her hand touched mine, and it was like an anchor. "Congratulations," she said, grinning. "That's worth celebrating. Beer or coffee?" "Beer," I said, and we both laughed. We were sitting on the porch, drinking beer and talking about her new project, a garden for the eco-home I was building. She suggested we work together, and I said yes. This wasn't just a project, it was the start of something new. I told her about the house I wanted to build, with solar panels, green walls, and a garden she could design. She got excited, started sketching on a napkin, and I looked at her, feeling like I could dream for the first time in years. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" she asked, looking at me. "To the gardens, the houses, to me?" I froze because this question was what I was afraid of. Was I ready? Caitlin had left a hole in me, and I didn't know if it was mended. But looking at Maddie, at her green eyes, at her dirty jeans, I knew I wanted to try. "I don't know," I said, and it was honest. "But I want to be prepared. Does that count?" She smiled, and her hand squeezed mine. "It is considered," she said. "But if anything happens, I won't let you escape." I laughed, the first real laugh I'd had all day. We drank beer and watched the sunset, and I felt the ashes of my past settle. Caitlin was in the past, with her lies, her guilt, her failure. Olivia and Ethan were safe, and I knew we'd figure it out in time. And Maddie was here now, and I wanted to be with her. "Let's build this house," I said, looking at her sketches. "And a garden, and maybe something else." "Anything else?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "You'll see," I said, grinning. "I'm full of surprises." She laughed, and I knew it was a start. Not perfect, not without fear, but a start. And damn, it was better than anything I'd ever had with Caitlin. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.